When my father raised his glass that night, he didn't toast me. He turned to my brother instead, smiling, proud, and said, "To the real soldier in this family." The room laughed, my mother laughed, and I sat there, quiet, pretending the sound didn't crack something deep inside me. It wasn't the first time. It never was. You learn, after years of being the disappointment that tried too hard, to hide your flinch behind a polite smile. You tell yourself they'll see you one day, when you've done enough, proved enough, become enough. But that night, I understood something I never had before. Some people don't want to see you. They need you invisible to protect their own reflection. So I didn't argue. I just watched the light on my brother's face and felt something inside me settle. Cold, final, steady. I'd spent my life earning their respect. Now I was done asking for it, and they had no idea what was coming next. The road home cut through fields the color of late summer, gold and endless. My hands rested loose on the steering wheel, the radio murmuring the voice of a newscaster talking about a storm building somewhere in the Pacific. The Pacific. My chest tightened for a second. Too many memories tucked into that ocean. I turned the volume down, letting the hum of the engines swallow the noise. I had driven this road 100 times before, but it felt different now. It felt like heading back into a story I thought I had outgrown. I pulled into the driveway just as dusk set in. The house still the same. White porch. The faint creak of the swing. The porch light that always flickered once before staying on. The smell of roasted meat drifted through the open kitchen window. I stood there for a moment, hand on the doorknob, and thought, coming home should feel like rest. But sometimes the silence in this house is louder than anything I ever heard in a war zone. The dining room glowed too bright. The kind of light that exposes rather than warms. My father stood at the head of the table, holding a wine glass high. His voice carried the authority of habit. "To Cole Dawson," he said, "the first real soldier in this family." The word real hung in the air, like a second toast I wasn't invited to. The table erupted in laughter. My mother refilled Cole's glass to the rim, her smile rehearsed and proud. When she turned to me, her tone softened in that careful, pitying way. She poured half a measure. "You shouldn't drink too much, sweetheart. You've got work tomorrow," I said quietly. "I just got back from Hawaii." "Oh, a vacation?" she asked without looking up, already focused on slicing the bread. The laughter around the table kept rolling. I stared into the glass, the golden reflection of the chandelier flashing across the surface like sunlight on water. For a moment, I saw the Pacific again, how it had looked the night everything went wrong and right at once. And then it was gone, replaced by the chatter of people who would never understand the sound of real silence. Cole leaned back, grinning, his tone playful but sharp around the edges. "You probably handle all the paperwork for guys like me, huh?" My father chuckled, tapping his glass. "That's why he's the first one truly fighting." The laughter came again, easy and familiar, like they'd practiced it for years. I cut my steak into pieces that felt too heavy to chew. Sometimes they don't need to hit you, I thought. They just need to laugh. No one noticed that I'd stopped eating. No one saw the way my hands tightened under the table. I focused on the sound of the clock above the mantel, steady, indifferent, ticking through the noise. When the meal was over, the plates clinked and chairs scraped back. I stood to help my mother clear the table, but she waved me off. "You're tired. Sit down. Let Cole tell us about the training." So I sat. I listened. I watched. The details of his stories blurred together. Push-ups, drills, sunburn, exhaustion. But the pride in their faces was clear, bright, blinding. Pride so strong, it left no space for anything else. Later, when the laughter had quieted, I walked down the hallway lined with old photographs. There it was, the picture from my graduation at West Point. The frame tilted slightly, a thin film of dust over the glass. I stopped, reached out, and then pulled my hand back before it touched. I used to believe that if I just kept showing up, kept fighting, they'd see me. But some people aren't blind. They just keep their eyes closed. I turned off the hallway light and stepped onto the porch. The night air was cooler than I remembered. I slipped my coat on, the fabric brushing against the small silver ring on my hand, the one engraved with 4 words that had carried me through darker nights than this. For those unseen. Under the porch light, it glinted once, soft and clean. Maybe being unseen is its own kind of survival. I walked to my car, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. The house behind me glowed in the dark, steady and still, like nothing inside it had ever been broken. As I pulled out of the driveway, the windows framed the silhouettes of my parents still sitting at the table, their heads close together. "Do you think she's upset?" My mother's voice faintly drifted through the open kitchen window. "She's strong," my father answered after a pause. "Just not strong enough to be a real soldier." The car headlights stretched across the empty road ahead. I didn't look back. And that was the moment I finally understood. In this family, love had always worn the face of dismissal. The air in Honolulu had a way of tasting like salt and sunlight, even when the day was over. I came home to my small apartment overlooking the ocean, dropped my keys in the bowl, and noticed the envelope waiting in the metal box by the door. The navy blue seal caught the light, that sharp insignia I'd spent half my life serving under. Inside, the letter was crisp, formal, and polite. "You are cordially invited to the Navy SEAL graduation ceremony, Jacksonville Naval Base." My eyes slowed when I reached the bottom. Presiding Officer, Major General Leon Rhodes. For a second, everything in the room went still. My hands trembled just enough to make the paper rustle. I walked to the window, staring at the reflection of the moon scattered across the Pacific, and for a moment, I saw myself out there, fragmented, distant, carried by the tide. I hadn't seen Rhodes since the storm. The memory came back as fast as the wind had hit us that night in 2018. The Pacific was a gray wall of rage, swallowing everything in its path. Helicopters circled low, searchlights cutting through rain. Somewhere in that chaos, I found him. A man pinned beneath twisted steel, blood mixing with seawater. His eyes were half open, shock-glazed. "You just saved my life," he gasped. "That's my job, sir." I had answered, pressing the radio to my ear, voice steady despite the noise. He'd smiled, just once, before the medics pulled him away, later, in the debrief. His words had stayed with me longer than the sound of the storm itself. True honor isn't loud. It's what you protect when no one's watching. Now, standing there in my quiet apartment, that same sentence echoed again, clear, calm, heavier than before. The phone rang, sharp enough to pull me out of it. My mother's voice came through, bright and careful. "Everly, remember to wear something light. All right? Don't overdress. It's Cole's big day. Let him have the spotlight." I turned toward the ocean again, smiling in a way that didn't reach my eyes. "Of course, Mom," she exhaled, relieved. "Already talking about flowers? Hotel rooms? Table seating?" Her voice faded as I lowered the phone and let her keep talking to an empty line. Some words sound like love until you realize they're instructions. Stay small. Stay quiet. Don't take up space that isn't yours. I hung up and went to my desk. The letter lay beside my laptop, edges straight, perfect. I opened my browser and pulled up the Navy's internal portal. Cole's file came up instantly. Commendations, field reports, glowing evaluations, recommended for exemplary conduct award. The phrase made my chest tighten in a way that wasn't envy, just the dull ache of recognition. I'd once been on that list too, before I learned that recognition doesn't mean visibility. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow above me. I had spent most of my life believing that silence was a kind of grace, that staying quiet, staying steady, would eventually earn peace. But silence too long turns into something else. It convinces people you have nothing worth saying. The sound of the printer interrupted the thought. I was booking my flight, clicking through confirmation screens out of habit. The page froze for a moment, then blinked. Across the top, in small gray text, A notice appeared. Security clearance. Level 5, confirmed. I couldn't help but laugh. A short, tired sound that filled the still room. Between my world and theirs lay entire systems built on codes they'd never understand. Layers of secrecy, clearance, authority, real, tangible walls. They had built their own, too, just less official, expectations, hierarchies, a family's quiet dismissal disguised as pride. I shut the laptop. Outside, the tide was coming in, waves brushing the rocks below the balcony like someone knocking softly to be let in. I stood there, looking at the dark horizon where the sea met the sky. The invitation was still on the table, its edges curled slightly under the weight of the humid air. I smoothed it out with my palm. The ink shimmered faintly, catching the faint light of the lamp, Jacksonville Naval Base, for a long time. I just stared at those words. Then I folded the letter neatly back into its envelope, slid it into my travel folder, and whispered to no one in particular. Jacksonville it is. The hum of the waves deepened outside, almost like approval or warning. Either way, the sound steadied me. I turned off the light and stood in the dark for a while, the Pacific wind pushing through the cracked window, carrying salt and memory. Some distances can't be measured in miles. Some storms don't happen at sea. Night had a strange stillness in Honolulu. The city's noise faded early, leaving only the rhythm of the ocean breathing beyond the glass balcony doors. My apartment sat in half shadow, one side washed in the soft amber glow of the bedside lamp, the other drowned in moonlight that spilled silver across the floor. On the bed lay two open suitcases, facing each other like two halves of a life I'd spent too long trying to balance. In the first, a white dress, pressed and folded neatly, low heels, a small bottle of perfume my mother had once sent me for Christmas, with a note that said something feminine for a change. In the second, my dress blues, formal uniform, polished black shoes, the silver insignia glinting beneath the lamp like a heartbeat I couldn't quiet. I stood there for a long time, eyes shifting between them, between two versions of myself that had never quite learned how to exist in the same room. The soft hum of the waves outside matched the slow pull of my breathing. Somewhere below, a car door slammed, then silence again. The air smelled faintly of salt and starch. I sat down on the edge of the bed, hands resting on the edge of the military case. My fingers traced the smooth line of the collar, the cool metal of the pins. The light caught my face in halves, one side warm, one side pale, and for a moment, I couldn't tell which belonged to me anymore. The memory rose uninvited, as clear as if it had been waiting behind my reflection all along. Guam, 2018. The rain was horizontal, sharp enough to sting. We'd been on the ground for 20 hours, fighting floodwaters that swallowed entire streets. A young soldier, barely out of training, was trapped beneath a collapsed beam. I remember kneeling beside him, my uniform soaked, radio pressed to my ear as I shouted over the wind, "If they can't see us, they'll hear us." I said, "Hold the line." He nodded, breath ragged, and gripped my wrist until the rescue team pulled him free. His eyes stayed fixed on mine, terrified, trusting, alive. That moment stayed with me longer than the mission itself, longer than the medals, longer than the applause that came later when the operation was deemed a success. Back in my quiet apartment, I heard my own voice echo the same words under my breath. Softer now, like a promise that still mattered. If they can't see us, they'll hear us. Hold the line. The sentence grounded me. It reminded me who I was before anyone tried to decide it for me. I folded the uniform with deliberate care, smoothing each sleeve flat, pressing the edges until they aligned perfectly. Then I closed the case and pushed the latch down. Click. A small, clean sound, barely audible over the surf outside. But to me, it rang like the starting drum of something I couldn't stop anymore. There are sounds too quiet for anyone else to notice. I thought, but for me, they echo for miles. I exhaled, half relief, half anticipation. The uniform was no longer just fabric and formality. It was the part of me that had been waiting, patient and silent, for permission to breathe again. I turned to grab my jacket from the chair, and that's when a folded piece of paper fell from the pocket onto the floor. I bent down to pick it up, expecting an old receipt or flight voucher. Instead, I recognized the handwriting before I even unfolded it. Cole's. It was an old service request form, creased and yellowing at the edges. My eyes caught the line that mattered most. Request for reassignment to the Pacific Rescue Division, the division I had commanded. I skimmed further down and found the denial notice scrawled in red. Application declined. Insufficient field experience. But just beneath that, a note he had written by hand. I want to serve where my sister once did. For a second, everything went still again. The waves outside rolled slower, or maybe it was my heartbeat that changed. I felt a tightness in my chest, not pride, not pain, something in between. He had wanted to follow the path I had carved, but he'd never said it out loud. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe it was easier for him to play the role they wanted, a son who fit the shape of my father's pride without ever questioning who built it. I smiled, small and sad. He'd been chasing my shadow without even realizing I was still standing in it. You wanted to follow me, I thought. You just never had the courage to say it. I refolded the letter, smooth and precise, and tucked it inside the pocket of my uniform case. Some truths don't need to be confronted to be understood. I walked to the window. The sea stretched dark and endless, the horizon glowing faintly, where the moonlight met the water. The reflection caught on the glass, faintly illuminating my face. The same woman who had been invisible at her own family's table, now standing in uniform silhouette against the open sky. Tomorrow, I whispered to the glass, I'll stop hiding. The sound vanished into the ocean wind, but I didn't need it to come back. It had already done its job. I switched off the lamp, leaving the room washed in silver light. The bed was divided neatly, white fabric on one side, dark blue on the other. I stood between them for a moment longer, then turned toward the door. The night outside was still alive, the hum of traffic distant, the steady crash of waves below, and somewhere deep in that rhythm, the faint echo of my own voice, steady and certain. Hold the line. I closed the door behind me. The air in Jacksonville was heavy with salt and pride. From the window seat of the plane, I could already see the base stretched out like a city of order and precision, rows of hangars, the coastline lined with flags catching the wind. When the wheels touched down, the speakers in the terminal played Anchors Away, and for a fleeting moment, the familiar melody almost felt like coming home. Almost. Stepping out into the sunlight, I adjusted the brim of my cap. My dress uniform clung perfectly, crisp against the breeze. The silver stars on my collar caught the light, throwing small shards of reflection across the concrete. Around me, families gathered with flowers and cameras, cheering for sons, brothers, and husbands. Laughter mixed with the distant call of gulls. Everyone here seemed to belong to something larger, something visible. They say returning to where you belong is supposed to feel easy, but if the people who made you can't even recognize you, what does belonging really mean? My parents were waiting near the entrance gate, my mother in a pale dress, and my father in his old Navy cap. Cole stood between them, posture straight, his white seal uniform almost too bright in the morning sun. My mother's smile faltered when she saw me. Her eyes drifted to my uniform, confusion flickering before she quickly covered it with politeness. We walked together toward the security checkpoint. My father chatted idly with one of the guards, proudly introducing himself as a retired officer. The young lieutenant on duty glanced at my badge, then straightened immediately and saluted. "Good morning, Colonel Dawson." My mother blinked. "Oh, it must be a coincidence. She works in an office." I returned the salute, calm, steady. "Mistakes happen," I said softly. "Sometimes the truth doesn't need your permission to show up. It only needs one person to see it, just once." Past the gates. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel and ocean spray. The crowd thickened near the bleachers, parents waving flags, children fidgeting in miniature uniforms. My family and I found our seats. My father started talking to the veteran beside him, a man with weathered hands and a proud chest full of ribbons. My boy's following my footsteps, he said. SEALs now. Real soldiering. My daughter. She helps the military in her own way, paperwork and such. Important, I guess. I kept my gaze on the field, my jaw tight. The strap of my cap cut lightly into my palm as I gripped it. I didn't look at him, didn't correct him. The sunlight hit the insignia on my shoulder, sending a thin flare across my sleeve. For a moment, I wondered if that flash had caught his eye, but he kept talking, oblivious. Then the music stopped. The brass band faded into silence, and the commanding voice of the announcer echoed over the speakers. Please welcome Major General Leon Rhodes. He walked to the podium, tall, deliberate, his uniform immaculate. Time had aged him, but not his composure. He scanned the rows of faces, new graduates, their families, rows of officers and veterans, and when his eyes reached mine, he paused. A brief hesitation, a glint of recognition, and the faintest smile. My chest tightened, the sound around me blurred. He began his speech, his voice even and confident, full of the kind of authority that doesn't need to shout. He talked about service, sacrifice, and courage that often goes unseen. And then he stopped mid-sentence. His gaze found me again, steadier this time. Before I begin, he said, I need to acknowledge someone who taught me what real courage looks like. He stepped down from the podium. The air shifted. The crowd murmured, then fell completely silent. His footsteps echoed against the concrete floor, slow, rhythmic, measured. Thump, 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 each one louder than the last. He stopped in front of me. Colonel Everly Dawson, U.S. Army Pacific Rescue Division, he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the field. The woman who led the mission that saved 49 men in the Pacific, including me. Every head turned. I rose instinctively, years of discipline guiding my movements. My arm came up in salute, precise, unwavering. The sun burned hot on my face. The wind lifted the edge of my sleeve. He saluted back. The silver on his wrist caught the light. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. And then he turned back toward the microphone. Today, courage salutes courage. The applause started slowly, then spread like a wave, one section after another, until the entire crowd was on its feet. Flags lifted, cameras flashed, voices cheered. The anthem began again, louder, triumphant. From the corner of my eye, I saw my mother's hand rise to her mouth, trembling. My father stood frozen, eyes wide, as if trying to piece together the version of his daughter he'd just seen. And Cole, he straightened, his expression unreadable, then raised his hand and saluted. The noise around me faded into something distant, almost unreal. They were all clapping for me, but I couldn't hear the applause. What filled my ears instead was the sound of 30 years collapsing into one moment. The empty spaces, the unspoken words, the weight of silence finally cracking open. It wasn't pride I felt, not even vindication, just stillness. The kind that comes when truth no longer needs defending. The wind carried the faint scent of salt water, and in it, I could almost hear the ocean miles away. The sound folded into the rhythm of the crowd, waves and applause, life and noise, blending into one indistinguishable hum. I stood tall beneath the white sun, my eyes steady, my breath calm. The moment stretched until it felt infinite. And then, as the music swelled and the flags rippled in perfect unison, I let the quiet return to me, standing in it like I had all my life, alone, unseen, and somehow more visible than ever. The ceremony ended hours ago, but the noise still clung to me, the applause, the flash of cameras, the press of strangers' hands. Now, the silence in the back seat felt sharper than the cheers ever had. The car rolled slowly through the Jacksonville streets, the evening light fading into a gray hush that matched the tone inside. I sat between my parents, the space tight but hollow. My mother turned slightly, her voice small, careful, as if she were afraid of the answer. Why didn't you tell us? I kept my eyes on the road ahead. I had told them, once. I had tried. They just never heard it as truth. So I said it plainly, quietly, like stating a fact. I did. You just didn't want to listen. She drew in a breath, but didn't argue. My father shifted beside me, clearing his throat. His tone was somewhere between pride and discomfort. You did well today, Everly. But it doesn't change the fact that women shouldn't be in danger like that. I turned my head toward the window, the reflection of sunlight slipping across the glass. The Florida skyline blurred into motion, the orange fading to gray. Danger's never been about where we are, I said. It's about who we become. For a long moment, no one spoke. The hum of the tires filled the silence, rhythmic, heavy. My father looked straight ahead, jaw set. My mother twisted her hands together in her lap. I could feel their thoughts pressing against the quiet, but none of them dared to form words. The air thickened until even breathing felt like defiance. When we reached the hotel, no one said goodnight. I walked ahead of them down the hall, the echo of my boots too loud for the narrow corridor. The keycard light blinked green, and I stepped into my room, closing the door behind me. The latch clicked, a sound final enough to feel like relief. Hours later, the ring of my phone cut through the dark. The clock on the nightstand read 2:14 a.m. I answered before the second ring. Colonel Dawson. The voice on the other end said, static crackling through the line. We have a level 5 storm forming near Guam. Multiple districts are at risk. We need your coordination immediately. I didn't hesitate. I stared at the faint reflection of my face in the darkened window. Calm, steady, already shifting into the version of myself that knew what had to be done. Understood. I'll be there. Across the hall. I could hear my parents' muffled voices in their room. My mother's faint laugh at something my father said, a sound too gentle for the night that was waiting. I sat on the edge of the bed, pulling on my uniform, the fabric cold against my skin. The insignia caught a trace of moonlight as I clipped it into place. I paused for one breath, long enough to look toward their door, and then stood, straightened, and picked up my travel case. I had once walked away from them chasing dignity. This time, I walked away to save lives. The hallway was empty. The elevator chimed softly, and when the doors slid open, my reflection stared back at me, composed, unreadable, the kind of quiet that comes before action. At the airport, the rain had already started. It came down in sheets, hard and fast, blurring the runway lights into streaks of gold and green. I ran across the tarmac, my coat plastered against my legs, my shoes striking the wet pavement in sharp, even rhythm. Inside, the terminal lights flickered faintly, casting reflections across the polished floor. In the glass, I saw myself small but solid, framed by the storm. The world outside was chaos. Inside, I was steady. They'll wake up and find me gone, I thought. Maybe that's for the best. Some truths don't need to be spoken. They only need to be witnessed from a distance. As the rain pounded harder, I boarded the military transport. The engines roared to life, and the vibration traveled up through my boots, grounding me. I fastened the harness and leaned my head back against the seat. The hum of the cabin settling into a rhythm almost like breathing. Back home in Missouri, my father sat in the living room, the television casting a dim blue glow over his face. On the screen, the footage from the ceremony replayed again. The general's salute, my name spoken over the loudspeakers, the wave of applause that had followed. My mother stood behind him, her arms folded tight across her chest. Do you regret it? She asked quietly. He didn't answer. He only reached forward and touched the screen where my figure stood beside Rhodes, his thumb brushing against my image like it might make me real. Some looks are apologies all by themselves. But that night, neither of us knew the next storm would show him who I truly was, far beyond a title or a uniform. The plane taxied down the runway, the city lights shrinking behind us. Through the small oval window, I watched the line of the coast fade beneath heavy clouds. Somewhere beyond them, Guam waited, dark, restless, alive with the kind of chaos that had always called to me more than comfort ever could. The engines climbed to a steady roar. Clouds swallowed the moonlight, and the cabin dimmed. I reached up to adjust my headset when a voice came through the radio. Steady, deep, familiar. Godspeed. Colonel Dawson. It was Rhodes. I smiled, a small, private smile that no one else would ever see, and turned my gaze back to the window. Honor might find its way back to you in the light, but courage, real courage, is proven in the dark. The aircraft broke through the clouds, swallowed by the storm ahead, beneath us. The Atlantic shimmered for one last second before vanishing into black. I exhaled, slow and certain, feeling the weight of what was coming settle perfectly into place. I wasn't running from anyone this time. I was running towards something. The cargo plane shuddered violently as it cut through layers of black cloud. Every few seconds, lightning flashed just outside the window, brief bursts of white that illuminated the tight faces of the crew. The radio hissed between static and wind. I stood by the operations table, maps spread before me, red marks crisscrossing the island of Guam like open wounds. A young officer braced himself beside me, voice raised over the roar. "Ma'am, weather's deteriorating fast. Should we abort?" I didn't look up from the coordinates. Not while there's still someone out there. He hesitated, then nodded, understanding that this wasn't a suggestion. It was a vow. People had called me reckless before, emotional, too stubborn for my own safety. I used to let those words scrape at me, let them linger like bruises. But strength doesn't live in muscle or noise. It lives in the refusal to turn away from a voice calling for help. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom. 5 minutes to descent. The plane tilted forward, engines whining against the wind. The metal frame groaned, shaking with every gust. I gripped the table until my knuckles whitened, watching the radar pulse, a red storm cell swallowing the island whole. When the wheels hit the ground, it wasn't a landing. It was survival. Rain tore sideways across the tarmac as the helicopter's rotors screamed to life. I pulled my hood up, heart sinking with the machine's rhythm. As soon as we lifted, the horizon vanished. Visibility 0. "Colonel!" a voice yelled through the headset. "Hold the line!" I shouted back. "If you can't see, follow my voice. Hold the line by sound." The rain hit like knives. Every second blurred into noise, the rush of rotor blades, the metallic clang of cables, the sound of men shouting through wind. We hovered over flooded streets where rooftops barely broke the surface of the water. Below us, flashlights bobbed like stars trying to breathe. I dropped into the chaos. The moment my boots hit the ground, the world narrowed to gray, wind slicing across my face, water up to my knees. A soldier stumbled beside me, shouting something I couldn't hear. Together, we hauled a trapped man out from beneath a collapsed beam. The air stung with the sharp electric smell of salt and fuel. Someone screamed incoming just before the explosion tore through the next street. The shockwave threw me backward into the mud. My shoulder hit hard, a crack of pain shooting through my side. Static filled my headset. "Ma'am, we're losing signal!" I forced myself up, breath ragged, blood warm against my sleeve. "Then use your instincts," I yelled. "Keep the line." The words barely carried over the storm, but I knew they heard. They always did. My voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to anchor them. I didn't need them to hear me clearly. I only needed them to believe I'd lead them out. Back home in Missouri, my parents sat in their living room, lit only by the flicker of the TV. The emergency news banner flashed. Operation led by Colonel Everly Dawson. Rescue still ongoing under life-threatening conditions. My mother's hand flew to her mouth as she sank into the chair. My father didn't move. He leaned forward, eyes locked on the screen. "She's out there," he whispered. "She's out there alone." His voice cracked on the last word, then softer, like a confession he'd never meant to make. She did what I never could. The blue light of the television painted his face, and for the first time in my life, his pride looked like grief. Back in Guam, I waded through water that had turned to ice against my skin. Two engineers were pinned under a steel frame, the tide rising fast. I slid beneath the twisted metal, bracing my shoulder and pushing until the pain felt like fire. The beam shifted an inch, then another. "Go!" I shouted. "Move now!" A soldier grabbed the first man, dragging him toward the helicopter. The second struggled to crawl. His leg caught. I reached back, hooked my arm under his, and pulled with everything left in me. "Ma'am, you're bleeding bad!" someone yelled. "Better me than them." The red of the warning lights flashed across the water, reflecting off the torn flag on my shoulder. The stars and stripes fluttered weakly in the downpour, half torn but still visible. There, in that moment, honor didn't look like glory. It looked like staying upright when the world demanded you fall. By the time we reached the extraction point, my legs were numb. The helicopter hovered low, spray whipping against the hull. A soldier grabbed my arm, hauling me inside. The hatch slammed shut. "We got them all, ma'am," he said quietly. 43 lives saved. I leaned back against the wall, breath shallow, eyes half closed. No one was left behind. The words came out more like an exhale than a statement. For the first time in years, peace found me not in silence, but in exhaustion. Later, as the helicopter banked toward base, I caught sight of the camera mounted near the door. Its red light blinked through the haze, recording everything: the storm, the chaos, the stillness after. By morning, that footage would be everywhere, across military networks. The image flickered on screens, me standing knee-deep in floodwater, rain carving lines down my face, voice calm through the headset as I directed the rescue. The clip spread faster than anyone expected. In Missouri, Cole watched from the kitchen, his hand frozen around a mug. His eyes didn't leave the screen. "She's the reason I joined," he said quietly. My father stood behind him, his hand resting on Cole's shoulder. His voice was low, rough with something new. "She's the reason I understand now. Back in Guam." The adrenaline finally faded. The storm's roar dulled to a hum as I sat inside the helicopter, head resting against cold metal. My bandage soaked through, my hands shaking from the cold, but my heart steady. Outside, dawn was trying to break through the clouds, a faint line of gold against a world of gray. I stared at my hand wrapped around the radio, the blood seeping through the gauze, and thought of everything that had led here. The laughter at that dinner table, the silence, the disbelief, the endless need to prove what should never have been questioned. Honor isn't about being seen. It's about standing when everything else disappears. The helicopter climbed higher, cutting through the last of the storm. I closed my eyes as the engines roared, the light finally breaking through. And for once, I didn't feel small in the sky. I felt whole. The corridors of the Pentagon always smelled faintly of steel and coffee, discipline disguised as routine. My shoulder was still bandaged beneath the uniform jacket, but I walked straight, each step echoing against the marble floor. Conversations dimmed when I passed. Heads turned. The news had already traveled faster than I could. Commander Davis met me outside my office, a cautious smile on his face. "That footage of you went viral." "Ma'am, the whole department's seen it. Then we'll work harder," I said. He nodded, unsure if it was pride or exhaustion he saw on my face. The door closed behind me with a low hum. The inbox on my desk computer was overflowing. Messages from military branches across the country. Notes from colleagues I hadn't heard from in years. Press inquiries, letters of thanks. I scrolled through them without reading. The screen light felt too harsh, too eager. Somewhere among the noise, one subject line stopped me. "We're sorry." The sender's name made my throat tighten. I opened it. "We just didn't understand what you carried." That was all it said. No explanations, no excuses. Just those words, quiet, incomplete, and strangely fragile. I read it once, then again. then hovered over the delete key. My finger hesitated only a second before pressing down. Apologies had always come too late in my family. I didn't need them to say sorry. I needed them to learn to listen with something deeper than ears. The afternoon stretched thin. Meetings, briefings, a quick round of handshakes. The storm on Guam had already turned into paperwork. By evening, I sat alone in the office, the lights low, my reflection faint in the window's dark glass. That was when the knock came. A security officer stepped in, hat tucked under his arm. "General, 2 civilians are downstairs. They claim to be your parents." For a heartbeat, I couldn't breathe. The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. I straightened in my chair, every part of me trained to react, to move. But I didn't. "Tell them General Dawson is in a meeting." The officer nodded, hesitated as if he wanted to say something, then left. Through the narrow pane of glass beside the elevator, I watched them below. My father's posture stiff, protective. My mother holding a framed photograph, the one of me in uniform, the edges worn from years of neglect. She clutched it close to her chest, hands trembling. They looked smaller than I remembered, almost delicate. When the guards gently guided them out into the night, I pressed my palm against the glass. It was cold, the way absence is. I closed my eyes, and a single tear slipped free, silent and uninvited. But I didn't go after them, not yet. The phone rang later, breaking the stillness. Cole's voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "They're reading about you. Ev. Dad's been quiet all day. Mom can't stop crying." I sat back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. "They're learning," I said. "Shame's the first step to understanding." He didn't reply for a moment, just breathed into the receiver like he was holding something back. "You're not angry anymore, are you?" "No," I said. "I'm just tired of explaining why I had to be strong." After the call, I left the office and drove with no direction in mind. Washington at night was a study in reflections, streetlights bending across the windshield, the soft blur of monuments in the distance. When I reached the Arlington Bridge, I stopped the car halfway across and stepped out. The wind off the Potomac was sharp, cold enough to sting. The city glimmered behind me, white domes and amber lights, beautiful and indifferent. I leaned against the railing and watched the river move beneath the glow of the bridge. The phone buzzed again in my pocket. The screen showed the same video everyone else had seen. Me standing knee-deep in floodwater, shouting orders through wind and chaos. I watched for a few seconds, then turned it off. Silence can feel like running away, but sometimes it's the only prayer survivors have left. The night held still around me. Somewhere in that silence, I found something close to forgiveness. Not for them, but for the version of myself who had kept waiting for it. Thousands of miles away, in Missouri, the same video played again on a living room TV. My father sat forward, elbows on his knees, his eyes fixed on the words scrolling across the screen. Commander Dawson's leadership saved 43 lives. His lips moved, barely audible. She did what I never could. My mother stood behind him, wiping her eyes with the corner of her sleeve. She walked to the closet, pulling out an old wooden box. Inside was the folded, torn flag from my father's service years. She set it on the kitchen table, threaded a needle, and began to stitch. The fabric trembled beneath her hands, but her fingers didn't stop. They didn't need to say, "I'm sorry." Every stitch was a word, every pull of thread, a confession. They weren't just fixing a flag, they were mending the truth. When I finally returned home, the city had gone to sleep. I hung my coat, unpinned the insignia from my collar, and let the quiet fill the space. The apartment still smelled faintly of salt and starch. On my desk sat an old photo of the 4 of us. Before the silence, before the walls we built between each other, I traced my fingers over the glass, the outline of faces that had once felt unreachable. "We're all learning, aren't we?" I whispered. The reflection of the city lights glowed on my shoulder, soft and silver, like the ocean under moonlight, faint, uncertain. but warm enough to feel alive. The sound of my boots echoed down the endless marble hallway, sharp and even against the stillness. The Pentagon had a way of amplifying silence, turning every step, every pause, into something that demanded to be heard. The walls were sterile white, the kind that made the air feel colder than it was. I carried the Guam mission report in one hand, a thin file that weighed more than it should. There are battlefields without weapons, only stairs you have to walk through. This was one of them. At the far end of the corridor, my assistant intercepted me, breath quick, eyes unsure. "General, your family is here. They requested a meeting." For a moment, I didn't move. The words sank in like a slow tide. I looked down at the folder in my hand, then back at him. "Bring them to room 4, I said, neutral ground. The conference room was bare, white walls, chrome table, fluorescent lights that hummed faintly overhead. The clock on the wall ticked too loud, every second deliberate, as if the room itself was waiting to exhale. I sat down, back straight, hands clasped in front of me. When the door opened, the air changed. My parents stepped inside first. Civilian clothes, ordinary, almost small. My father's shoulders, once squared by habit, seemed to sag now under something heavier than time. My mother clutched her purse with both hands, eyes darting to the floor. Cole followed behind, his seal cap in hand. They hesitated at the threshold, unsure whether to approach or stay where they were. I didn't smile. I didn't stand. Not out of cruelty, just balance. For once, the distance between us was equal. The door clicked shut, sealing the silence in with us. The light from above reflected against the metal table, catching the faint silver of my rank pins. My father spoke first, voice careful, worn around the edges. "We thought you wanted distance." I held his gaze. "I wanted space." I said, "Space to be seen." My mother's voice broke the quiet next. "We're proud of you, Everly." I turned to her, my tone even. "No, Mom. Pride requires presence. You weren't there." Her face fell, her chin trembling as the first tear slipped down. My father reached over, taking her hand, something I hadn't seen him do in years. He didn't argue. He just sat there, eyes fixed on the reflection of the table's light. Cole stepped forward, a quiet breath before movement. He set something on the table, an enlarged photo from one of the news articles. Me, in the middle of the storm in Guam, blood on my sleeve, the helicopter light behind me cutting through rain. "I used to think courage had to shout," he said softly. "You taught me it can whisper." The words hit something deeper than I expected. I stared at the image, at the red streak that had once been my blood. A single tear fell before I could stop it, landing on the glossy surface and spreading into a blur. The soldier in the photo looked distant, almost unrecognizable. Someone I used to be, someone I'd never fully left behind. My father cleared his throat, breaking the silence. From his coat pocket, he pulled out a worn envelope, edges yellowed, paper soft from time. "We found this in the basement," he said quietly. "Your letter from Guam. 10 years ago. We never opened it." He placed it on the table, the old paper trembling in his hand. His voice cracked as he went on. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, just understanding." I looked at the envelope, my handwriting faint, the ink slightly smudged, a letter that had never been read. "I don't need an apology," I said. "I just need you to stop comparing us." He nodded once, slowly, and looked down. For the first time, he didn't argue, didn't deflect. He just listened. The clock ticked again. The room was still, except for the faint hum of the overhead light. Sunlight filtered weakly through the blinds, spilling across the table in broken lines. The glow reflected on the metal surface, catching all three of our faces in the same faint shimmer. I waited 30 years for this conversation. I said, "This is where I learned to stand tall, without anyone behind me." They didn't respond. They didn't need to. The silence between us, for once, wasn't made of judgment. It was made of understanding. It wasn't about victory anymore. It wasn't about who had been right. It was just stillness, and that felt enough. The air softened. The ticking of the clock blended with the faint rhythm of our breathing. When the meeting finally ended, they stood to leave. My father helped my mother with her coat, his hand gentle against her shoulder. Cole lingered a moment longer, his eyes saying what his words didn't know how to. Before she turned to go, my mother reached into her bag and took out a frame wrapped in brown paper. She set it on the table and unwrapped it slowly. Inside was my graduation photo from West Point, the one that had once hung crooked and dusty in their hallway. "We'll hang this one in the center of the house," she said, her voice shaking but certain. I smiled. Small but real. "Make sure it stays straight this time." Her eyes softened. A quiet nod between us, sealing what words couldn't. When the door closed behind them, the light shifted, falling across the table. The stars on my collar caught the reflection, scattering tiny bursts of silver against the wall. I sat back, hands resting on the file I'd been carrying, the envelope still lying unopened beside it. Some battles aren't meant to be won. They're meant to end in peace. For the first time in my life, the silence in that room didn't feel like distance. It felt like understanding, thin, fragile, but real. There are wars that leave scars, and there are wars that build bridges. This one, finally, had done both. The clock ticked once more. The air was steady, still, and I let myself breathe. The morning light over the Pentagon was blinding in its clarity. Rows of flags caught the steady breeze, their fabrics snapping softly like a salute from the air itself. The parade ground shimmered under the warmth of the sun, immaculate and deliberate, the kind of order that hides the chaos it's built upon. Behind the stage, I adjusted the cuff of my dress uniform. The medals caught the light, glinting with the subtle authority of experience rather than pride. My lungs filled with the thick, bright air of Washington, heavy with ceremony and meaning. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing it in. General Rhodes approached from behind, his voice low and steady. "You ready to be seen?" I turned toward him, my expression calm, the faintest trace of a smile at the edge of my mouth. "I'm ready to just stand." He gave a quiet chuckle, nodding in approval. That's what real strength looks like. A drum roll began, distant at first, then growing louder, pulling every thought into rhythm. The sunlight flashed off the brass instruments of the band as I stepped forward. My boots struck the pavement in precise cadence. The crowd beyond the podium rose into view, a sea of uniforms, reporters, families, all painted in red, white, and blue. When the drums stopped, the silence was total. Rhodes stepped up to the microphone, his posture flawless, his voice filling the open air. "Today, we honor those who serve beyond recognition, those whose names may not appear in headlines, but whose hands carry the weight of the impossible." He paused, and then looked directly at me. Brigadier General Everly Dawson, recognized for leadership under extreme conditions, and for her commitment to life above all else. He turned toward me. I stepped forward, the heat of the moment pressing down on my shoulders. The silver star rested on the velvet cushion in his hands, gleaming under the sun. I bowed my head slightly as he pinned it to my uniform. For an instant, the world went quiet again, as if the sound itself wanted to respect the stillness. When I raised my eyes, the crowd was already standing, rows upon rows of people on their feet, saluting. Among them, front and center, my family. My father's hand raised to his temple with trembling precision. My mother beside him, her eyes shining. Cole stood tall, his expression a blend of pride and something softer. Recognition, maybe, of everything that had come before. I returned the salute, my hand steady, my face composed. There were no tears, no breaking voice, no cinematic moment of collapse, just a small, quiet smile. This was never about vindication. It was about visibility, and I finally understood that the two were not the same. Rhodes stepped forward again, turning to the microphone. General Dawson once said that service isn't about being seen, it's about showing up when no one else can. The applause began slowly, then swelled until it filled every corner of the courtyard. Brass and percussion rose to meet it, the military march weaving through the sound like a pulse. Cameras flashed, flags rippled. The music, the cheers, the sunlight, all blurred into something vast and humbling. Through the glare, I caught sight of my father lowering his hand. His face turned away slightly as he wiped his eyes. My mother leaned close, resting her head against his shoulder. For the first time, he didn't resist. When the ceremony ended, the air felt lighter, emptied of performance. I slipped out through the side gate, the polished stone of the Pentagon steps glowing under the afternoon sun. My gloves came off easily, fingers breathing again in the open air. I looked up at the sky, a perfect, impossible blue, stretching wide enough to swallow every mistake, every silence. I used to want them to see me as strong, but real strength, I thought, isn't about being seen. It's about standing tall even when no one's looking. The breeze moved through the flags again, whispering through the metal railings, brushing against my sleeve. I stood there until the noise of the crowd faded behind me. Later that evening, a reporter caught a photograph on the Pentagon lawn, a single frame of me saluting my father. The shot was clean, backlit by the fading sun, his tears barely visible through the light. By nightfall, it was everywhere, on military newsletters, in local broadcasts, and finally, in the morning paper of a small town in Missouri. The headline read, "From the Shadows to the Stars, the Dawson Legacy." I read it once, sitting alone in my office, the hum of the fluorescent lights above me steady and low. The photograph stared back, me and my father frozen mid-salute. The distance between us finally bridged by silence and understanding. I smiled, faintly, setting the paper aside. Sometimes the world needs proof. Other times, it just needs to watch someone keep standing. The dawn came softly over Pearl Harbor, gold bleeding into the horizon like something reborn. The ocean was calm that morning, the kind of quiet that hums beneath the skin rather than around you. My house sat near the shore, small but open to the light, every window facing the water. I stepped outside barefoot, the boards of the deck cool beneath my feet, and breathed in the salt air. The waves broke gently against the sand as I jogged along the shoreline, the steady rhythm of my steps keeping time with the sea. The air smelled faintly of coffee and morning rain. I used to count every sunrise by what I'd lost. The names, the faces, the storms. But today, as the light touched the water, I remembered something simpler. Every dawn, I think of the ones I saved, and the ones I couldn't. But this morning, I remember myself, inside. The desk by the window caught the first spill of sunlight. On it sat 3 framed photographs, each one balanced carefully against the next. My father in his old navy blues, standing straighter than I ever remembered him. Cole in his white SEAL uniform, grinning like he'd finally found his place. And me, in my dress uniform, stars catching the light. A faint smile that looked more peace than pride. Between them lay a single envelope postmarked from Virginia. The paper had been folded and refolded so many times, it felt like it had traveled farther than the miles suggested. I turned it over in my hands. The handwriting familiar, steady, deliberate, my father's. I opened it slowly. The words inside were short, written with the restraint of a man who had spent a lifetime holding back what he meant. You were the ocean all along. Everly. We just didn't know how to swim. The sentence sank deep, gentle but unrelenting. My throat tightened. And for the first time in years, my tears came easily. They weren't heavy, not like before. They carried no anger, no exhaustion, just release. I placed the letter beside my coffee and watched the horizon where the sea met the sky. The line between them blurred in the sunlight, endless and forgiving. Somewhere far away, in Missouri, the morning light spilled into the Dawson living room. My parents stood before the wall they had rebuilt, the wall that once divided memory and regret. In the center now hung the photo of me, flanked by my father's Navy portrait on one side and Cole's SEAL graduation on the other. The flag from my father's service, once frayed and forgotten, now hung freshly stitched beneath them. My mother had sewn it herself, her hands trembling but steady. The breeze caught its edge through the open window, and for a brief moment, it lifted just enough to let the sunlight pass through. The light painted a faint cross on the wall. An accidental blessing. Back in Hawaii, my phone buzzed once. Cole's name lit the screen. "They put your picture in the middle. You know," he said. I laughed quietly, glancing back at the 3 frames on my desk. After 30 years, that wall's finally breathing again. We stayed silent for a moment, both listening to the sound of the waves through the receiver. Then a faint crackle came through the radio on the dock outside, an old voice carried by distance and static. "Hold the line, Dawson," the familiar call from years ago, a memory folded into the present. I smiled, closed my eyes, and let the sound wash over me. The ocean, the voice, the air shifting with the tide. Out on the deck, the sun had risen fully, painting everything in gold. The water shimmered, alive and endless. I stepped forward until the surf touched my feet, the light catching the silver stars on my shoulder. Honor isn't something you win, I thought. It's what remains when you stop fighting to prove it. The camera would have pulled back then, if this were a film. The figure of a woman standing at the edge of the world, sunlight blazing across her uniform, the Pacific stretching wide before her. The screen would fade to white, the sound of waves filling the space where words no longer belonged. And in that white silence, there would be peace.